Hello, and welcome to a Sagely Health webinar. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. We're glad to have you here. My name is Jeremy. I'm the CTO of Sagely Health, and I am joined, as always, with Dr. Jason Sager. Hi, Jason.
Hello. Good to see you, Jeremy. Good to see you, everyone.
So today we're going to be talking about clinical trials. For anyone unfamiliar with clinical trials, we've done a previous webinar that gave a really good overview of clinical trials, and we'll link to that in the description. So if clinical trials are kind of new to you, that's a great place to start. Today we've gathered a bunch of questions from our patients at Sagely Health, from people who have registered from the webinar, and just from our experience. And so we'll kind of rapidly go through a number of questions today. So Jason, in addition to being the founder and CEO of Sagely Health, I was wondering, could you give us a little bit about your background and how you kind of developed your expertise in clinical trials for cancer?
Yeah. And again, I went into medicine to help patients. And, in doing that, what I found was the best match was in pediatric oncology, kids with cancer. At the same time, I was at Johns Hopkins and started to learn about science and the importance of science and the relevance of that to cancer and how to help patients through the scientific method. And again, my mentor, Bert Vogelstein at Hopkins, was really instrumental in teaching that to me. So then when coming out of it, I said, well, I loved helping patients, but I also want to help many patients. And so I went into drug development and began to work in companies like Genentech to help create medicines to help cancer patients. At some point, about 10 years ago, I said, hey, I want to get back to helping patients more because I could see a gap in the system where doctors, oncologists, and patients were not finding their ways into clinical trials or getting advanced therapies or diagnostics. And I wanted to help with that so that we can actually create a better outcome for every cancer patient. And so that's why I set up Sagely Health. But by virtue of having been through this sort of path, I have both the clinical aspects in oncology, and we help guide many adult cancer patients as well as children. And then the experience of developing drugs, which I still help companies to do today in terms of guiding biotechs and helping them to develop their drugs so that they can benefit many patients. Again, all towards the aim of helping patients with cancer. But that's a little bit of my background and why sort of this topic of clinical trials is really exciting to talk about. And there's a lot to be said.
Great. So let's start. I've kind of bucketed these into a couple of different areas. The first one is finding and evaluating clinical trials. So one of the places people find clinical trials is ClinicalTrials.gov, and there's information up there. So I just want to ask you, as someone who understands this space, is that information online accurate and up to date?
Yeah. Unfortunately, no. And not because of anyone trying, but again, there's several reasons. One is that it was created as a repository, as a regulatory step, so that you have to register your trial with the government to let them know that what you're doing so that they could supervise it. It was not there to help patients find clinical trials, nor oncologists find clinical trials. So it wasn't really built that way. As a result of that, there's often very outdated information. And that happens in a variety of ways. There may be sites that are open, cancer centers that are open today running that trial that aren't named on ClinicalTrials.gov, or ones that are named and are no longer running the trial. There could be another big criteria is in the inclusion and exclusion criteria. What do patient need to have in order to get on the trial? And again, it may be called a solid tumor trial, but tomorrow it's for metastatic colorectal cancer patients with MSI high. And so, we have an MSI high patient, but they don't have metastatic colorectal cancer. Maybe they've got something else. And so, again, there's these mismatches that happen, and those have a lag time for kind of catching up. And then, there's other problems as well. People don't post the results and that sort of thing. It's really there just to capture sort of what's out there as opposed to what the results are. And we find that integrating the results of a trial or previous trials to then predict what the next trial is likely to do to benefit a patient is really important. And it's just not there in ClinicalTrials.gov. So overall, it's a starting point for us, and it can be for patients, but there's many other aspects that need to be integrated in. And we call cancer centers all the time. Cancer centers will have their own sort of list of registries of trials. Those two are often outdated. So we'll oftentimes find out if a trial is actually running from the clinic that we believe is offering it. And then finally, none of these sources tell you if there's a slot available for the patient. And as we answer more of the questions, I know this question of how do slots work? How does a participant, spot open up for a trial? And then how does a patient qualify for that spot?
So if a patient is trying to get one of those spots, one of the things they might come up against is understanding randomization and blinding. And I'm wondering, could you just explain what randomization and blinding are in the context of a clinical trial?
Yeah. And again, we've talked a lot about the structure of trials in the last walkthrough. Here today, we'll just jump into the fact that the expectation as someone as a company is developing a drug is to ask the question, well, how well does this drug work compared to something else? And usually that something else is the standard of care, sort of that which has been approved already. And so in order to find that out in a trial, they would basically have two arms, one which is getting the experimental drug. It may be even drug plus the standard of care. In cancer, that's oftentimes how it happens. And that's randomized against the standard of care. They may try to dress it up a little bit by slipping in a placebo, so it'll be standard of care plus placebo. But just to address the fact that in cancer, very few placebo-only trials. You're not going to be a cancer patient dying of cancer and just get a sugar pill. Right. That's considered unethical. And so there may be very, very edge cases where it's appropriate to do that sort of thing, but most of the time not happening. And we'll tell you if we find a trial that's doing that. So we come back to the randomization, and then basically half the patients, sometimes it's 2/3, but mostly times half the patients will get on the drug, the new drug. Half the patients will be randomized to the standard of care. And that can be problematic because if you're randomized to the standard of care, and let's say you're traveling to go get this drug and trying to get onto that, well, getting the standard of care is not very interesting at all. And matter of fact, you could just get that, with an oncologist down the street. And so why would you remain on the clinical trial? So there's a few things that the world has done to try to adapt to that situation. By the way, we have an answer long-term that we love to enable, which is that patients who don't get on the clinical trial or doing the standard of care could be the comparison cohort. That being said, that's not where the world is today. And so while we're trying to build towards that future, for now, there is this sort of randomization event. And then the two things that are done to try to help with it is blinding the trial or a crossover design. And we can go into a little bit of each of those.
So blinding meaning you don't know if you're getting the standard or the experimental drug or which arm you're on.
Exactly. And that's where they'll dress up the control arm, the standard of care arm, they'll slip in a placebo. And then, you may not know. You won't know. That's the design, is to try to prevent the patient and even the doctor from knowing whether or not the drug is being given or not. And again, there's reasons to do this to try to make it very even and unbiased. And so, but at the same time, it's often disconcerting to patients to not know which of the two are being done. And sometimes there's just no way of really easily, disguising it. If the new medicine causes, let's say, itchiness in all the patients, well, the placebo won't be causing itchiness, and then patients figure out on their self, oh, well, I've got itchiness, I'm getting the drug, it's good, right. That sort of thing. So we see that all the time, and so it's not a perfect system, but that's the reason why it's there.
Okay, so having explained that, could you explain what a trial crossover is? Because that's come up with some of our patients, and I'd love for you to explain that.
Yeah, and that one I like a little more than the blinding. So if you had to randomize, crossover is basically saying that you start off with either the medicine or the standard of care, but at the point where you're progressing, the cancer is growing. If you're on the standard of care, then you automatically get to go on to the medicine. And that's really nice. Now, obviously, it'd be nicer if they could start with the medicine at the beginning, but understanding that they've got to separate these two out, at least there's an opportunity to get the medicine at that point. And so I think a lot of folks like that idea, that kind of rescue. Okay, well, I'll stay on the trial, even if I'm on the standard of care, eventually I'll get the medicine. The only issue to that is that oftentimes today, still, survival and how long patients live is the most important thing in terms of determining if the government gives approval for the drug. And if your drug is really good and you get, and everyone's progressing after the standard of care and then they go on to the medicine and they live a really long time, then all of a sudden the two arms look very similar. And so, there are situations where if the medicine is looking to get there sooner rather than later, if the government is really looking for survival and not progression-free survival, which is how long is the cancer controlled by the medicine, well then, that the crossover can mess that up and make it look more confusing. And so some companies will be urged by the government not to do that. And we know that recently there's been a lot of excitement around this KRAS G12D inhibitor called RMC with a number. And the fact is that, they're not allowing crossover, mostly likely because the government has pressured them into saying like, hey, like we got to see the survival data here as quickly as possible. So don't allow crossover. So again, it's nice when it's used. I can understand when it's not used, why. And at the same time, again, there are no great solutions to this problem.
So one of the questions we got was, when you have a clinical trial, that clinical trial might be run at a number of different trial locations across the country. And so someone's question was, can the different trial sites, the different cancer centers that are running the trial, be at different phases of the trial? Or are they all in lockstep?
Right. And so it's important to understand that when these trials are run, they're generally run by a sponsor, and that sponsor is usually a company. It can be a single institution, like a doctor at one of the cancer centers, but basically it's all coming from one place. And in that sense, there's many centers that may be implementing the trial, but the control nerve, the center, is all coming from one place. And so the idea is to run the trial in quote unquote lockstep, right? That there's just one way of doing things. Now, and so if it's a phase 1 trial, for example, there may be 3 patients per dose level that are being assigned. Well, one center may have 1 patient, another center may have 2. There may be a third center and everyone gets 1 and everyone's happy. There may be a 4th center and then maybe it's 3 out of 4. And then maybe 1 patient, is too sick to get on the trial. And so one of the other centers steps in. So that's the way it sort of works. But always with that sort of center command coming from the place of origin, usually the drug company or the investigator who's controlling the trial, running the trial. And so generally lockstep. There can be some unique situations, for example, a biopsy sub-study, which is only done at one of the centers or 2 of the centers. So you can always ask, basically, is there a slot available for me? And if not, if I were to go to is there any centers outside of this center where a slot on this trial might be available? Again, there's no downside to asking that. They should tell you the answer. But most of the time, the answer is there's either a slot available or not, and it doesn't help to go to a different center.
So along that subject, like we had a question of should a patient focus on one particular trial, like kind of finding the perfect trial for them and pursuing that, or alternately get themselves to a center that's running multiple trials that could fit them? Could you speak just a little bit about how to think about that?
It's a great question. And the answer is a little bit of both. And this is how we do it. Because the information about the trial, especially the success, the efficacy success, and some of the side effects, there'll be a lag time between when the data is known by the doctor who's running the trial and when that data is published. That may be 6 months, could be a year, could be even more. And so you could go to a trial center and say, hey, Sagely Health told me about this trial, or I found this trial and it looks really good. It looks like a great match to me. What do you think, doctor? You're running this trial. Is there any information here that would say you're excited about me, a patient who looks like a great match, getting on this trial? And they may say, absolutely, you got to get on this trial. Like, this is it's an amazing trial. We've already seen some hints of success. It's nice when they say that. Sometimes they don't, but
Right.
and the side effects, they're manageable. I'm comfortable dealing with this drug. Come on the trial. There may be times where they go, we may want to show you a different trial, oh, well, or there's no slots for that trial right now, and you need treatment now. And so it's really nice to go to a center with multiple trials. We say at least, the kind of 3 or 4 is the kind of the sweet spot. Sometimes we just sent a patient, I think they have 19 trials, for this patient. And in the sense of saying like, hey, here's the trial that we're here for. And this is what we position patients to do. Here's the trial that we're here for, doc. Tell me, is this the trial that we should go after? We know that you're running other trials. Are any of them even more exciting to you for me than this trial? And if so, why? And then hearing a little bit more about that is really, to us, sort of the secret to success. So a little bit of both.
So that brings me to the next question, which is, if a patient hears about a trial, are there any red flags like that would suggest that trial is not actually worth the patient's time?
Yeah. And again, there's different types of trials that go on. What we've been talking about so far are therapeutic trials that are testing a treatment itself. And that treatment is a new drug, usually has some sort of, letter name like RMC 6236, that sort of thing. Sometimes they'll have a longer official name, but they're testing a treatment. There are other trials that are observational, and and sometimes they're erroneously labeled as treatment. That's another problem that ClinicalTrials.gov can have. But these trials are there really to watch a patient on a medicine that is coming from outside of the trial, which is generally a standard of care or something that is not so innovative. And in that sense, it's worth taking a look at them, but definitely at least a yellow flag would go up to me for observational studies to make sure that that's really going to be helping a patient. Some of them are for diagnostics. And again, diagnostics can be really helpful. But some of them don't tell you the results of the diagnostic test, the patient. And so then less helpful for understanding, what that would mean for a patient. And so a variety of different trials exists. There's yet other trials that are looking at side effect management. And again, they can be really helpful. Are they worth traveling thousands of miles for? Less likely, but still possible. And so those are some of the brackets that we break our trials down into to know which ones may be most valuable for a patient.
If a patient is considering a trial, what are some of the key questions they should be asking about that trial before they enroll?
Yeah. And we've touched on this a little bit, throughout, but let's talk very, specifically. The first question is, is this trial the right trial for me? Is this a good match scientifically? Right? We'll get into, but we usually get, we almost always get diagnostics, especially next gen sequencing, genetic analysis, sometimes RNA analysis, and sometimes proteomics, protein analysis, that tell us scientifically that this patient matches the philosophy, the theory that this drug has been developed for. For example, this is a KRAS G12D inhibitor. We have a patient with a KRAS G12D driven cancer. That's a good match, right? Sometimes it has to go more specific than that. Pancreatic cancer. Okay, we can do that too. So that's sort of the first level is, am I a good match for this trial? Or if not, are there other trials for which I'd be a better match? The second question is there a slot available for me on this trial? Do I fit the entry criteria? And is there anything that I can do to be a better fit for the trial? Do I have to be healthier? Do I have to be, have certain labs like a platelet count of 95,000 or higher? What is it that the trial is expecting? And again, there's a consent process that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit. But signing consent and getting that consent form is a way of kind of finding out a little bit more about what the trial will be looking for. The third thing is sort of, is this site near me? Are there logistical support in me getting to the center and getting the trial? And so in here, there's a little bit of a secret weapon, which is almost all trials that are run by corporate sponsors, companies, drug companies, they include budgets to help support patients who need to travel, stay in a hotel for a couple of days, which is most patients. Even if you're traveling in, the center may ask for the first week or so to be relatively close to the center. Sometimes that goes even for about a month or so. And then over time will become a little bit less and you can travel a little bit more, but you still want to get back to the center, even if you're driving an hour and a half for these trials. There's still a cost to these things. And centers have the ability, when a drug company is running it especially, to help reimburse those patients for those costs. However, because of the way the consent works, and you're not supposed to quote unquote benefit from anything, many times sites are precluded, are restricted. They're not allowed to tell patients that they have that benefit for them until after they sign the consent. They say, I want to be on this trial. And then so one thing you can say is, is there a reimbursement allotment for patients as part of this trial? And, and I understand if you can't tell me right now, but, once I sign the form, then, I would expect that you can tell me then. And that's okay too. And remember that patients, even after you sign the form, you're not obligated to enter the trial. So you can sign as many forms as you like. If it turns out that either you're not a match for the trial, so again, the trial will select the patient, but then the patient also selects the trial. And so they can withdraw at any point in time. The consent really doesn't have a bearing on that.
Well, that brings us to the next thing of going on a trial. And so what are some of the common reasons patients might be turned down for a trial? And I'll combine it. Are there any strategies to kind of improve one's eligibility for a trial?
Yeah. So repeat the first question for me.
Well, it's like, what are the common reasons people are turned down for trials? And then is there anything you as a patient can do about that?
Yeah. So what first of all, we see most patients that if they're a good match for the trial, and if you're going through what's printed, and sometimes there's a lot that's on ClinicalTrials.gov, sometimes there's very little. It's harder to match with the very little part, but at least if the patient's matching from a perspective of, of what's on publicly available, then yes, the likelihood is greater than 50% chance they're going to be able to get on the trial. So that's the first biggest thing, to make sure that you fit what's sort of on in there. And that can be hard. These can be laundry lists of things and can be hard to go through. And then the other big thing is, are you healthy enough for a trial? And most trials are for ECOG, what they call ECOG 0 or 1, which generally means the patient's walking around and doing daily chores and daily stuff. They don't have to be jogging a marathon, but just able to get to the doctors and get back. Where it becomes problematic is if patients really have a hard time with that, either mobilizing, they're really in bed for more than half the day, or they're living in the hospital and, maybe they're going to be in the hospital for a while, or maybe a rehabilitation center. Those situations are much harder to get access to clinical trials on. So we see some folks falling off for those reasons. And then there's a whole bunch of other reasons. And generally, it can be labs, like my platelet count's too low, and maybe wait a week and it'll be higher. And they have some flexibility to retest. It may be I'm taking a medicine and I need to stop that other medicine, and that can be an antidepressant. It could be even like an acid with a proton pump inhibitor, which are quite common, omeprazole. They may have to hold off on taking it for a little while. Well, can I switch to a different medicine that I am allowed to take? These sorts of things. Those things we find are less likely to have a patient come off if they're healthy. Then they generally have the labs that are needed. Sometimes they may need a transfusion or something like that. But those are the main reasons why we see patients unable to enter in a trial or get, quote unquote, not accepted to the trial.
So when you see that eligibility criteria, how flexible is that? Do they make exceptions to the criteria they publish?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in general, they try hard not to. They really try hard to stick to the entry criteria, either because they're trying to keep the population fairly. Again, if they're testing this drug in KRAS G12D, well, if they start taking KRAS G12R and G12V, they can't really answer the question about G12D so well. That being said, there is a lot of flexibility sometimes, especially initially, that trials are looking for solid tumors. And there, if you're a scientific match, you've got KRAS and this is a KRAS drug, then yeah, it doesn't matter if you have pancreatic cancer, colorectal cancer, or breast cancer. You can, if you have that mutation, you can get on the trial. And so looking at it that way, I think can be quite helpful. They try hard not to though go against what's written there. And again, what's hard is sometimes that information changes and it's not updated. And so you may find that it's changed, and that's where we try to debug things for patients before they go to the doctors. Okay, are we working with the most recent updated information? And so that's something that we can help patients with.
Great. When a trial is a match and it's exciting, sometimes trials fill up. And so could you talk about, I understand they have a waiting list often, but could you talk about a little bit how the slots and waiting lists work?
Yes. And some cancer centers have them, some don't. I generally am quite in favor of them because I think, again, there's no restrictions on them generally. You can say, put me on the wait list. If there's not a slot today, do you have a wait list? That's a question we always prompt our patients to ask. And if the answer is yes, please put me on it. Again, it doesn't obligate you. If they call, and oftentimes they'll call pretty quickly. If they are holding a wait list and they expect there may be a slot in a month or a week available, then they generally go through those wait lists quite quickly because lots of patients are doing lots of different things. And so, the chances are put yourself on the wait list. There's no reason not to. On the other side of it, just understanding how trials works with these slots can be really important. And in general, the early phases of trials will have fairly small numbers of patients, let's say 3 to 6 patients come on, and then there'll be a couple of weeks between those patients while they look for safety, and then the next 3 to 6 patients come on, usually at a higher dose, and then they watch again for safety. And so there's a lot of quite a quickly staggered approaches. It's a little bit different than phase 2s and phase 3s where they're enrolling a specific number of patients, but then at some point they'll hold enrollment. And even in phase 1s, they'll hold enrollment at some point in time and say, okay, well, let's look at the data. Let's see how effective this is. Let's see how safe it is. So those will be filled cohorts. And then you could ask, well, and they'll always say like, well, there may be more coming out. There may be another cohort open in the next couple of months. That generally is not, a couple of months is not the general time frame. So if you're hearing it's going to be a couple of months before the next sort of, group comes potentially available versus a couple of days or a couple of weeks, to us, that's a little bit of an indicator on which ones to kind of chase after versus which ones to kind of look beyond to other trials or other ways of getting access to a drug that, that could be effective.
You touched on this a little bit before, but I wanted to ask about the informed consent paperwork. So when you go in a trial, they're going to get a piece of paper, like a big stack of paper in front of you called informed consent, ask you to read it, go over it with you, and then you sign off of it. So what should patients know about that, and what should they be asking at that point?
Right. And it's a really important part of the process. Frankly, we think that, if patients had to consent for the regular standard of care, they might be much more likely to go on the clinical trials. That being said, it is the time frame where you'll learn much more about the drug, or that you can learn much more about the drug, and that the company will learn much more about you and if you fit for that drug. And again, we can based on the public information, knowing what that drug is doing, we can sort of, pre-assess the fit and make sure we're matching patients as best as possible, so they have the highest likelihood of getting through that consent process and what they call the screening process, which is generally about a month long. But there are opportunities there, and they're not all written down on the pieces of paper, because there's usually, these things are like 30 pages long, and they're just really, really hard to get through. But a couple of points, right? One is that you can ask, and it's in there, but you can ask for the staff to help to point out what's the schedule like? Am I going to be expected to be here on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis? And maybe it'll start off on a daily basis for the first week and then go to like a every 2 or 3 week basis. And then after a couple of months, maybe it's just a monthly basis that I have to come in. But understanding the logistics of it is really helpful. The other opportunities are to learn a little bit about the efficacy. And again, it may not be listed in the consent, but you can ask, hey, doctor, is there anything known about this drug in terms of helping patients like me? See what they say. And more likely, are there any, to get information about, are there any side effects that they've seen in this drug that would be expected, that I could expect to see? Is it like rash in everyone and that sort of thing? And then if so, is there anything I could do about that to either prevent it from happening or to take care of it if it does happen? What things should I tell you about? What things should I be looking for in this drug? So those are all questions that I think could be quite useful for patients to ask during this time frame, almost regardless of what's in the paperwork. One more note, which is that in the paperwork of consent forms, you will often see almost entirely, you'll see something in the sense that, we're not offering you something that will benefit you. You're doing this because you're helping other cancer patients that may benefit after you. Please sign off on this idea. Some patients struggle with that a lot. Like, what do you mean you're not trying to benefit me? That's why I'm here. I want to be benefited.
Right.
Just everyone should know that everyone wakes up in the morning on the drug company side, as well as the patient side, to try to benefit from what's going on here, right? And again, that's why we try to help match these patients, because if the patient's cancer matches the scientific hypothesis, that's the most likelihood that they'll benefit from the drug. There's still sort of that government system in place. And again, a long time ago, the chances of benefiting were so low that they said it's unfair to tell patients that they should expect a good outcome. So we'll make them sign off that there's no benefit here. There's no benefit that we know of. That may still be the case, but there's a likely benefit. And so, that's what everyone's trying for. So in the sense that I would, gently ask, to me, the better question is, am I a good fit for this drug, for this trial? And if the answer is kind of like, well, I'm not sure, then let's pick a different trial. But if the answer is yes, it's really good fit, then sure, sign off on that dotted line. It's okay. I don't, I understand you're not going to tell me you're going to benefit me, but I'm still going for it. And that's okay.
If a cancer patient goes on and participates in a clinical trial, do they have to change doctors? Do they keep their primary oncologist? How does that work?
And this is a really good question, because, many cancer patients, almost all, will come and say like, well, I have one oncologist. I have an oncologist, and I go to that oncologist to get my treatment. And, honestly, I think that's the preferable way. It's simple, right? Unfortunately, the way the system works is that the primary oncologist usually can give standard of care, but the way the clinical trial system is it's distributed. And so the doctor next door may be the one that has that trial that's right for that patient. And so what we're often doing is helping patients to get connected to the right doctor to give the right treatment at the right time. This often means that they may be going to a second doctor, or even a third or a fourth if they have high-risk cancer that is expected to come back sort of time and time again. To keep doing well, you may have to sort of, juggle around with a number of doctors. It's not a reason to give up any of the doctors. And so, again, the primary doctor is absolutely fine, and they can get labs and they can follow the patient, and maybe there's a side effect. Maybe they live close to the patient, so if there's a problem, the patient can get into them. They'll know about the trial. They may have to call the other doctor to find out what to do. But again, we see oncologists better as working as teams than as individuals. And for patients who are proactive and start to see the world in that way, again, there's no reason to say, Doc, I don't like you. I'm going over here to this other doctor. No. I'm going over here to go get that treatment. And yeah, that doctor's great. You're great too. And I would expect to come back to you, and you can continue to help me. but really developing a team of doctors and incorporating new doctors as needed, because again, we don't know which trials are going to be where, and then we find out and there's a new doctor, but not giving up the old other doctors or the primary doctor is fine.
So switching gears a little bit to actually being on a clinical trial. So besides the difference in the treatment itself, are there other kind of key differences to being on a trial as opposed to just getting standard of care?
Yeah, the good of it is that you're going to be watched over quite closely and monitored. You'll have, nursing care. If there's questions that you have, I think they're more likely to be more rapidly answered than if you're not. Now, that's does not say it's an entirety, but in general, you're going to get more attention to more medical care, which in general is quite good. Um, there's some downsides, which is that, you may have to adjust your vacation schedule a bit because that doctor who said, oh, yeah, we can hold the standard of care for a week or two, go off on your vacation and come back and we'll just resume. Here, there may be there will be less flexibility to do that.
Yeah.
Now, there'll be some times where after a couple of months, there will be windows to take a vacation, but it might have to be 3 weeks and not a month. You might have to, do some lab check-ins. We've helped patients to find doctors who can do their labs and send them back to the original, the trial doctor while they're on vacation, or to have a doctor as a backup in case they get into trouble while they're on vacation. And so, but know that the medical care is generally better from my perspective because it's more regimented on a clinical trial.
You touched on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit more about the cadence and the schedule of being on a trial?
Yeah.
What should a patient expect when they go on a trial?
Yeah. And, and just to talk, rewind a little bit and talk about that a little bit more detail. Generally, trials will start off more intensive in terms of schedule and will get a bit less intensive over time. And so even, in terms of taking the drug, it will be on a schedule, right? No, and we can talk about if patients get into trouble taking the drug, if they have side effects and that sort of thing, but they're going to be monitored pretty frequently at first, especially if it's a newer drug. And so you might be in the clinic actually on a daily basis for 2 or 3 days out of the first week, and then on a weekly basis for the first month or month and a half. And then after that, maybe it's once a month. After like 6 months or so, it may be once every couple of months, and or even a phone follow-up. Especially if it's an oral drug, they'll come in, pick up my drug and go home and keep taking it. And so there's varieties to this, and that's where in the consent process it's important to ask about those questions of what's the cadence like for this particular drug for this particular trial. And then a little bit of how it might change if we get into if the patient's having trouble with side effects.
So on that note, how do researchers assess how a drug is working during the trial?
Yeah. And, so they're looking for two things. The first thing is safety, and the second thing is efficacy. Safety is all about how well is the drug tolerated. Efficacy is about how well the drug is working to keep the cancer from growing. For efficacy, patients will get serial scans, imaging. They may get other tests like a blood biomarker. And there's a variety of different ones that are done. That being said, generally, they're getting these imaging could start with every 6 weeks or 8 weeks. You can go to every couple of months over time. And each of those, either they'll see that the tumor is shrinking, which is response, either a partial response or a complete response. It'll be staying stable, which means basically it may be shrinking a little bit or growing a little bit, but it's basically within the boundaries where we can't really tell what's going on, and so we'll call that stable. Or it could be growing, and they'll call that progressive disease. On the safety side, they're really looking at the side effects and how patients are feeling, as well as some of the labs. And they'll be checking the white counts and the red cell counts, and they'll be checking the liver enzymes and other chemistries. And there, as well as they'll ask the patient, do you feel nauseous? Have you been vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, all of these things. All of that's actually captured and graded in a government issued document called the CTCAE. They're up to version 5, and actually it's publicly available. And what we do is we help patients to understand, let's say they're vomiting. Well, is there something that they can do for that? That would be a great question to ask the trial doctor. Maybe they've seen this before. Maybe they find that taking a medicine a half an hour before taking the drug is going to prevent that nausea and vomiting. And then how severe is it? And we help patients to understand, based on the CTCAE guidelines, how severe that's likely to be when the doctor hears about it. And again, this is a time where that kind of information can be really helpful, because some patients like, oh, I'm miserable on this drug. Well, oh yeah, I vomited once. Okay, well, that would be graded as mild, but I understand you're miserable, and let's see if we can change that. But we're not going to stop the drug because of one vomiting. At the same time, a patient could be like, oh, I'm doing great, doc. Yeah, I go home and vomit like 10 times a day. Oh, no. Like we got to do something different, right? So, again, understanding sort of where the parameters are in terms of that mild, moderate, severe, and life-threatening also indicates sort of what they're likely to do with the drug. And they do their best not to kick patients off trial, but they might hold the drug, let a patient recover. It's called interrupting the drug therapy. They might reduce the dose of the drug once, maybe twice, just to see if we could find a tolerable dose, something that would work for the patient and still work to fight the cancer. And so those are the things that are written to almost every single trial. Every trial that I know of has those instructions in there. And so that's a really important concept. And so we can dig into that. I think probably there's some other questions, but we can dig into that further.
Well, that covers safety really well. If patients are experiencing side effects, what happens and how the protocol kind of helps them react to it. What about the efficacy? Like, do trials, like they look at it, oh, this is not working, we need to stop? Or do they look at it and say, oh, this is really working and we're going to change now? Like, how much do they change a trial based off early findings in efficacy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, again, from the efficacy perspective, it can be a little confusing. There are these designations, and we talked about them, right? The complete response, partial response, stable disease, or disease progression. But we also talked about that stable disease where there's some wiggle room, and that if it's growing but not growing a substantial amount, and we know exactly what that number is, it's 20%. So if the cancer grows less than 20%, meaning when they measure it as best as they can do with these things, it hasn't increased by 20% or more, then you're in the stable disease bucket. Now, again, it may be trending towards that point. And so a doctor, usually maybe the primary oncologist, would take a look at the scan and say, oh yeah, well, this is progressing. Or the patient may know, the trial doctor can say, well, you're not off yet, but it's looking like it's growing. That's a great time to start finding a new trial. Because once you get to a progression in general, then you're off the trial to determine that the drug will be no longer useful, or the combination of drugs, and then it's time to find the next regimen and therapy. And that's just the way the system works. On the other side, response is the same way. You could be sitting at, you could be shrinking very slowly over time, but it doesn't reach this sort of magic 30% mark where they say, oh, you're a partial responder. And everyone gets excited. Well, I think it's pretty exciting to be stable disease for a couple of years. Now, that doesn't generally happen, but, it can be certainly months and months and months. And for patients with high-risk disease who are living with cancer, this could be a great benefit. And so from our perspective, helping patients to understand, like, again, they'll say, well, I'm on this trial and they say it's not causing the disease to shrink, but I'm still on the trial. Should I get off the trial? It's like, no. Go and enjoy the period of stability. And that could be somewhat unique from our perspective.
We've heard from patients, having fear that they'll be kicked off a trial. They feel like the intervention is working and they kind of have this fear. So obviously there's a certain amount of progression that's going to get them kicked off the trial. But is there anything a patient can say or do that would get them kicked off a trial?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, what the main concern that I hear about are the side effects. that, hey, I don't want to tell the doctor that I'm vomiting because, or having, I don't know, severe diarrhea, because I'm afraid I'm going to lose this trial, which, I mean, maybe there's even some data showing that I've got that long-term stable disease, or maybe the cancer is shrinking. And so I don't want to risk that. So I'm not going to tell them anything. Right. And I totally understand that. Just know that the way that the trials have been set up are not to do that. Right. It's really to get the information and then utilize this to try to best benefit the patient. And so, again, if it's a mild or moderate situation where there's some mild or moderate symptoms going on, oh, yeah, I've got some soreness in my mouth, but I can still eat well, still drink. Maybe I do some mouthwash a few times a day. And they may recommend something like, oh, we've got this magic mouthwash or something else you can do. And that will help you. That's great, right? Mild to moderate, not a worry. If the CTCAE says that it's severe or life-threatening, then generally the drug is going to be held for a period of time to allow that patient to recover. Doesn't mean that they're getting kicked off the trial, especially if it only happens once. The likelihood is they're going to come back on. They might come on with the same dose. They might come on with a lower dose to try at that, to make it tolerable for the patient. So that's really important. The trials that I write or I've written, I put in at least 2 times that the patient could do that. I think most would allow that. If there's a benefit that's happening, even if there's a severe side effect, the doctor is allowed to petition for the patient on their behalf to say, look, I get it. Like, this patient's really sick, getting something that they've had to be hospitalized for. That's a criteria for what they call a serious adverse event. Had to be hospitalized. Sometimes that might be for just a day, but you still kind of capture that sort of category. But they're benefiting from the drug. So even if this is like the 3rd time, I want to continue with this drug. I want to give them that benefit. And again, there are rules written into every single trial which allow for that based on clinical benefit. And so just for patients to know, the system is not designed to kick them out. The system is actually designed to try to hold on to them for as long as possible and make it fair for them. And yet with the rules, so that, if something's really obvious, like the tumor's galloping away and growing, then yeah, we gotta try something else.
What if a patient wants to leave a trial?
Yep. Great question. Patient can leave a trial any day, at any time. They just say, I'm withdrawing my consent. And that's it. It can be for a very good reason. Like, hey, like I have this moderate side effect and you're telling me that nothing needs to change, but I'm telling you I'm miserable and I've had enough of it. And therefore I'd like off the trial, please. And that's perfectly good reason to come off of a trial. It may be because the doctor, it's like really far away, and maybe the patient's having difficulty with family matters or anything else. Again, ask about any kind of subsidies that could help to support the patient in getting to the trial, or even in paying for care for kids or other things in order to help them to stay on the trial. But at some point, if they can't, they can't. And but they're able to withdraw. Patients can withdraw from a trial at any time they want, simply by saying, I withdraw my consent. And it's a really important aspect that most patients don't really understand. That also means that if there's a new exciting medicine or a new approved medicine that that they want to go get, they can withdraw from the trial and apply for a different trial, or go to a different doctor to get a different trial. They still have to match for that other trial and be accepted, but that's something that they can do.
So if you are on a trial, could you switch trial locations? Like if you were in New York City being treated, but it would be more advantageous for you to be in California or Massachusetts or something that had a location there. Could you switch to a different location?
Right. And oftentimes what might happen is at first you're going to the trial center that's open and available. In a couple of months, maybe they open up a new center that's near to your house. My understanding from the authorities, and I've asked some good friends in good places about this on the clinical trial side, I was surprised. The answer is yes, that patients should be able to transition from one center to another. That being said, I haven't seen it commonly done, but just know that in theory, it can be done. So if you find yourself in this situation, certainly it's something to ask about. And I would ask both the center that's treating the patient as well as the center that they would be going to. because again, the centers may need to talk to each other in order to transfer all the documentation and what's necessary. But again, these are centrally administered, so the database is the same. The patient doesn't have to change anything. And so, I mean, they don't have to change anything structurally in order to enable that, which is where I think the yes comes from. And so just, ask.
One last question, and it's a follow-up on the other one. You kind of got into this, but if you were on a trial and you realized there was a different trial that you'd rather participate in, you said you can leave that trial and go join that other trial, but is there anything else you should kind of know about making a switch from one trial to another?
Yeah. And, there's a few things. One is, again, you still have to qualify. So again, you can leave the trial any day, anytime. The new trial, you'd still have to qualify. And that starts with understanding you're a match, and as we referred before, but you'd have to also meet all of those entry criteria. There's often also a washout period. And this really is irrespective of if you're coming from standard of care or another trial. They'll say you need to be off of all anti-cancer medicines for a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's as short as a week. Sometimes it's as long as a month. Usually it's the same period of time that the standard of care would have been given anyway. So I'm getting my Folfox every 3 weeks. Well, you have to be off for 3 weeks. Okay, that's like doing nothing different, and that's okay. But again, just to know ask the new trial, what's the washout period for if I were to switch from one trial to the next? How long would I have to be off of all therapies before anti-cancer therapies before joining the trial? The other thing is that just to be cautious, because if the drugs are related or if they're attacking the same protein, for example, we just had a patient who was asking about coming off of one KRAS inhibitor and going on to a different KRAS inhibitor. Oftentimes trials will be restrictive. So the new trial will say, we allow all patients with a KRAS mutation, but not those that have been previously treated with a KRAS inhibitor specifically. And so just ask about from the new trial if there's any restrictions based on the therapies that have been delivered so far. Sometimes there'll also be lines of therapy restrictions where they'll count, okay, you've been on 2, you can get on the trial. You've been on 3, you can no longer get on the trial. So again, it's important to ask the new trial whether or not there's any restrictions based on what medicines have already been given into getting in. And if you hear no restrictions and they have a slot and you look like a good match, then go for it. Give it a try, especially if there's good efficacy data to back up the new drug, the new trial.
That's great. That's I skipped some questions to kind of get it in time, but I would say that this has been amazing information. Jason, could I just ask you to give a little bit, like we've said, all this information you understand about trials. It seems like a lot of work. It sounds like so I was just wondering, could you talk a little bit like what are the values of trials? Why should patients be understanding this information? How does it benefit them?
Yeah. And again, I want to break this down into low risk and high risk cancer. We've talked about that separately. If you have a low risk cancer with a really good, meaning a greater than 80% chance of a cure, it's absolutely fine. Go to a great cancer center, go to one that's NCI accredited, go get that standard of care. But if you're in the group, and it's quite a large group, probably 60% or more of cancer patients, unfortunately, who are in the high risk bucket, then really you should be looking at clinical trials at every step along the way, as you also look at standard of care. And again, the system is not designed to really do this, but that's where we really help. And sometimes there'll be a trial right from the get-go that offers the potential of doing better. And we've had a patient who's experienced that with Enhertu and HER2 positive breast cancer. There are examples of that in almost every situation. But there's also examples that as patients progress, if the cancer comes back, there'll be more and more options available. How do those match the scientific sort of value and the diagnostics, the advanced diagnostics that we help patients to get, and then align to getting treatments that are most likely to benefit them? Again, those are more likely to be clinical trials. So in general, we come back to sort of the adage that, if you're in that high risk category, look at clinical trials first, often, and every step of the way. And if there is an opportunity to get access to a clinical trial that matches the genetics of the disease, the proteins, the scientific rationale, get yourself onto that trial, because more likely it'll work in a targeted way, in a personalized way, than the standard routine, which we already know doesn't work that well, because that's what the high risk is all about. And so at the end of the day, big proponent of clinical trials.
All right. Well, I think we can wrap up there. I will just mention here at Sagely Health, we are tracking every single trial for cancer and how well it's doing so that we can make these types of matches and introductions for people. We know it's a lot to deal with, so we're here to help people navigate all parts of this, and clinical trials can be a really, big step towards finding something that's going to work for you. So Jason, any other final thoughts?
No, I think that's good for today. But thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I look forward to speaking to you next time.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now.